Hi everyone, this is going to be an introduction to the Exploratory Draft number 1. I know we've already read the prompt, but we'll reread it and do a quick exercise where we look at the definitions of poetry to see these technical skills that we discussed in the last video being highlighted and just make sense of what kind of things you can talk about in your Exploratory Draft 1, things you might want to explore, pay attention to in the Kenneth Koch reading, pay attention to in the Edward Hirsch reading, and any other reading that you choose to do on your own. So I'm going to pull up a document that we'll work off of and go from there. Let's see. Okay. So let's read the prompt once more, and that will springboard us into these definitions here. Exploratory Draft 1 says, we've been close reading poems since the quarter began and have talked a little bit about poetry and how poets create meaning. We will continue to do so in the coming weeks, but as a first step to the final essay, I'd like you to define and explain as much about poetry as you can at this point. You have the 4 dictionary definitions to refer to, but you also have our class discussions, the Edward Hirsch reading, and the Kenneth Koch reading. Your definitions and explanations need to be specific. Don't just repeat the dictionary definitions above. Instead, use them as a starting point to explain more. For example, how do images suggest ideas? How does the sound of language create meaning? How does a poet create specific emotional responses? How many ways can poets organize the line, etc.? These are just sample questions, by the way. More questions you could generate by yourself and answer. I'm just using some of the language, even of the definition, to generate questions that could lead to some interesting explanation. This needs to be 500 words, just about 2 pages minimum. Of course, you can do more. So I wanted to spend this video simply breaking down the 4 dictionary definitions listed here for poem, poetry, poet, and poetic. And out of that, extract the technical skills that were listed in the prompt. And then also look at the abstract qualities of poetry that these definitions show us. And these might be avenues that you explore in your exploratory draft. Asking questions like, how does that happen? What does that actually mean? We know that the definition mode of discourse means taking an idea or a term and saying, to me this means, or what I think this means, or what this means to me is, and expanding on it, and maybe even giving examples of what that could look like. So let's start with the technical skills. I'm just going to read the first 2 definitions of poem and poetry to get these technical skills highlighted, and then we'll go back to all 4 to look at the abstract qualities. So the definition for poem is a piece of writing in which words are carefully chosen for the images and ideas they suggest, and in which the sounds of the words, when read aloud, often follow a particular rhythmic pattern. So I put in bold 4 categories, 4 skills, the technical skills that poets use, and I'll write them here. So the first one is diction, words carefully chosen. Now, words carefully chosen could be taken many different ways. Literally, could be the order of words. It could be the sound of the words. It could be the tone of the words. For category skill of diction, what I mean by this and what you'll actually be writing about is tone. So maybe this should even be reversed, that the skill is how poets make meaning with tone. And tone, as we know, because we practiced it in the style portfolio, comes from specific diction choices that establish the writer's attitude towards the subject they are writing about. We also have a reference to images. And we know that we have imagery. We first practiced these as the physical senses, the concrete world, etc. But also within this we practiced metaphor. And metaphor uses imagery, so it's part of the same category. The definition also says the sounds of the words. And so we have sound, and we practiced this in the style portfolio as well. That is a technical skill that poets use to make meaning. And then lastly, when read aloud, follow a particular rhythmic pattern. And so we're going to call this form. Form could be what we call rhythm in poetry, or rhyme and rhyming patterns. We haven't read many poems that are in poetic form. William Butler Yeats's The Lake Isle of Innisfree, the first poem we started with, is definitely in a form, both rhythmically and rhyming. And by form, I guess I say in the prompt, what I mean by this is a pattern as well, form or pattern. And so we have 4 dictionary definitions mentioned right there, or 4 technical skills in the dictionary definition of a poem. Let's look at poetry and also see this repeated. Poetry is writing that formulates a concentrated imaginative awareness. So that gives us our imagery of experience in language chosen. And language chosen is going to be our diction and our tone category. And arranged. Now this is an interesting one. This is going to add onto the skill list for us. Language that is arranged, that could be form, rhythm and rhyme and pattern, but it also could be lineation and syntax, because we know that the way you arrange your sentences is called syntax. And when we add in poetry this idea of a line, where the words don't go from the left to the right margin of the page, where they break at some point and begin a new line, we're going to call this lineation. So there's our 5th technical skill. It says then to create a specific emotional response through meaning, sound, we have sound, rhythm, we have form, rhythm, form. And a secondary definition is the art of exciting pleasure by beautiful, imaginative, or elevated thoughts. So there are our 5 technical skills. Let's add to this list of technical skills the abstract qualities. Here's the reason we're doing this. The technical skill that you choose will be the topic of your essay. You're only going to focus on one of these. These abstract qualities, though, that we'll list will cover the effect that poetry has on its audience. It will maybe help you answer how these specific skills have that effect in general. And these, of course, are general thoughts, but you can make them more specific as we go along. So some of the abstract qualities that we see in this definition. Let's see, poem, a piece of writing. So here's an interesting one. For ideas, they suggest. So we'll say poetry suggests or implies claim, argument, ideas, but doesn't directly claim them. And we talked about this early on, the difference between the poems we're reading and then the essays we read from Barbara Holland. The essays make direct claims. They directly state what they're about, and then they set out to convince the audience to believe them. Now, poetry takes out the direct claim. They just suggest the idea. They imply it through images, through tone, through form. And then also at the same time, the rest of the poem is evidence and support for that implied claim. And we'll get more into that as we go. But there's a good one. They follow a particular, okay, nothing else from this. Poetry. Writing that formulates a concentrated, imaginative awareness of experience. I like this term quite a bit. Poetry makes its readers, well, I'm going to say writers and readers, no possessive. Aware of the experiences, often emotional, we as humans have. This idea of awareness, calling attention to, seeing something in a new way, presenting something in a new way that makes people think and reflect on their own experience. That's definitely an abstract quality or maybe even result or benefit of poetry. Let's see. They create specific emotional responses. I think that's an interesting one. Poetry suggests ideas and arguments by making the reader respond emotionally to what they write, not just in topic, but in the detail and in how the information is presented. It's another good abstract quality or benefit that we're asked to respond emotionally to details, to descriptions, to metaphors, to tone. And it's when we have that emotional response that the poet is telling us there's something important to pay attention to, that there's this idea or argument that's being suggested. Okay. The art of exciting pleasure by beautiful, imaginative, or elevated thoughts. So I like elevated or exciting pleasure and elevated thoughts. Poetry is a way to excite pleasure in the reader. Now, some of you might think poetry is really boring, and many readers out there who don't read poetry say, oh, it's boring, and there's nothing enjoyable about it. Maybe the idea is that the more you know how poems work, the more you know how they function, the more pleasure you as a reader will get. That might be one way to approach your argument, but we'll get there later. And I also like the other thing. Poetry offers readers a look into interesting, elevated thoughts or ideas that they may never have considered. I'm going to add one thing here. Poetry, let's see, how do I want to say this? Poetry shows the reader what is valuable in life. Remember the question when we read a poem, what does this poem value? That's a good question to ask. Let's see if there's anything from these that's different. Poet means Greek for maker. That's where I get the class question, how does a poet make meaning? Because poet literally means maker. In the same way, again, that someone makes something physical, they're just making something that is in words. A person who has the gift of poetic thought, imagination, and creation, together with the eloquence of expression. And we got this idea of elevated thoughts and imaginative awareness of experience and creation. So we already touched on that. Poetic means having an imaginative or sensitively emotional style of expression, having a beautiful or graceful quality. Again, I think that idea of beauty and that idea of emotional expression we've already covered in this list of abstract qualities. Now, this list is not complete. These are just qualities that we abstracted from the definitions, the dictionary definitions of poetry in the 4 forms. And that's going to help you with your Exploratory Draft 1. I want you to explain as much about poetry as you possibly can How does tone work in a poem? How does imagery work in a poem? How does sound work? What is sound in a poem? What is form? What is lineation? You're going to define and explain. Define and explain. What's the effect of poetry in these skills? There's some abstract qualities. Now, these are just starter ideas here. You're going to develop your own based on what you get in the reading and based on what you've gotten out of the videos so far. So, I can't wait to read these first exploratory drafts. Um, the next video will cover the Kenneth Coke reading, The Language of Poetry, and revisit the Edward Hirsch reading, How to Read a Poem, to talk about how they discuss and how they develop definitions for these technical skills and the qualities of poems.